Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, this week, we're going to wrap up a couple of other things over the next couple of weeks on this question of evolution before we reach Thanksgiving. And just wanted to talk about a couple of additional theories and a couple of things that probably warrant some discussion, but we just didn't have time to get them in before we finished our main conclusion. So having walked through what we're looking at in all of this, the question comes to mind, well, are there any other alternatives or things like that? And one of the other questions that kind of hangs out there sometimes is the idea of panspermia. So the idea that life originated somewhere else in the universe and that it was seeded onto Earth. And then life began from that life that came from an extraterrestrial source. I want to walk through a little bit where some of this gets some credibility. And I'm not saying Richard Dawkins lends the idea credibility necessarily, but I want to go back to a quote that we've talked about of Dawkins before. And I want to walk through the improbability of what we're talking about here and why this is not a valid theory that we need to spend a lot of time on. This is why I wanted to wait till later to talk about it. So again, the idea would be is that life developed somewhere on another planet. And the life was able to develop and then through some means, and the some means kind of becomes questionable, but somehow that life traveled through the cold vacuum of space and then was deposited here on Earth at a point in time where somehow it was able to take root and thrive. And whether that was little green aliens who, flew here in their flying saucer and deposited that life, or whether it hitched a ride on a meteorite or something else like that, that life was able to travel through the vacuum of space and to get here, and then that's where we came from. It seems to be a plea to try to get around the question of the origin of life. And of course, the problem is relatively straightforward, that not only now do you have to explain the origin of life, then you have to explain how life got here from a distant planet someplace. So let's walk through and talk a little bit about why. And I want to go back to a quote from Richard Dawkins that I think maybe describes one of the issues. I think it frames a little bit the issue for us a little bit. So I want to go back to the God Delusion and talk a little bit about this. We've done this quote a lot of times talking about the sheer luck required for the origin of life. And Dawkins starts off, nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. And then he goes on to talk about the rest of it. And one of the things that I mentioned before is this next part where he talks about the statistical improbability of what we're looking at. He says, for example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell with a nucleus and various other complicated features such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. That's going to be where the rubber hits the road here. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. We'll talk about that in weeks to come. One-off events like this might be explained by the anthropic principle along the following lines. There are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria. That's where we're going to stop. All right, Dawkins asserts that there are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria. And by positing that as a theory, he's then able to say, well, if you've got billions of planets where life is already developed, life is very common, and therefore, eventually, this is like the multiverse. If you just have enough chances, eventually, we happen to be the winners of the universal lottery. In this case, we happen to be the winners of the lottery of life. And because there were billions of other planets where life originated on, we just happen to be the one out of a billion where we just got lucky and here we are. There's two huge problems with that ought to be relatively straightforward. Dawkins asserts that there are billions of planets where life has developed. On what basis does Dawkins make that statement? We have no indication whatsoever that there are billions of planets where life has developed. Certainly, I'm not aware of it if we have any indications that there are. Now, a lot of times what you'll see is NASA will announce, well, we found a planet that might have life on it. And if you kind of learn to read through the headlines on those, oftentimes what that means is, well, we found a planet that might have liquid water on it. Because most scientists will agree that water is going to be necessary to support life. But the presence of liquid water by no means indicates that you're going to have life associated with it. You just simply have water. And while water is necessary, water doesn't equate to life. So Dawkins' first problem is his jumps to this assumption that life has originated on billions of planets. We have no indication of that whatsoever. And even if we did, even going back to his friend and colleague, the jump from basic life to complicated life is one that there is no scientific path for. But I would also contend in all of this, and we've talked about this a lot of times in the past few episodes especially, there is no good pathway from the chemical world to the biological world. And the more we learn, the more unlikely that pathway becomes, certainly by any random mechanism like natural selection and random mutation. So there isn't a clear pathway, and you can't just assume that life developing is common. And it would go like this. If life is really developed on billions of other worlds, then life could have certainly evolved to a point where little green men could have brought life here, or where life could have been transported here on the back of a meteorite or something else. I'm not saying Dawkins supports that idea, but Dawkins clearly supports the idea of life being common. It's kind of the Copernican principle, but applied to the idea of biological life. I think we've talked about enough. That theory, you just can't make that assumption. You can't make that jump. There's too much at stake. It's too difficult to go from the chemical to the biological, and you just can't get there. And the problem that panspermia has got is, let's say you had life develop on another planet. That life would have, again, this is a process that would take billions of years, right? We're all in agreement. The universe is not that old. The problem that you're going to have is for life to have developed somewhere else and then been seeded to Earth, that life would have had to have developed in the very early universe. Before the heavy metals existed, things like carbon, things that we need, the building blocks that exist for us, that wasn't present in the early universe. That came after the first generation of stars died and seeded the universe with those things that would eventually be necessary for life. So you've got an even bigger hurdle to assume that life was able to develop somewhere else. And then that life was able to travel at random, unless we believe it was E.T. who did it, that life was able to travel at random through the universe, land on our planet, survive the re-entry into our atmosphere, survive the cold vacuum of space, survive all of these things, and then be seated on our planet, and then began all of the unlikely steps that we talked about in the last episode and that we've talked about for all these weeks. The idea of panspermia is so much more difficult and so much more unlikely. It's not surprising that maybe the internet is one of the very few places where it finds a home. And there are still people who pursue it as a scientific theory, not a lot. There are still people out there pursuing it and trying to figure out the mathematics around it. But logic and reason should tell us that if life is nearly impossible, if not, in my opinion, impossible to develop through a naturalistic process here on Earth, what in the world are we talking about that it would, what are the odds that it could develop somewhere else, absent the heavy metals that it needs to develop, absent the things that life needs to get going, and then that it could be transported across the vast coldness of space to be deposited here at exactly the right time to see the life that we find around us? That idea just literally defies any logic and reason that we could apply to this. So I wanted to wait until we were done because I felt like it was important to have last week's episode behind us. But as we start to close in on an answer, the idea that life could have been seeded here by an alien race, by some extraterrestrial means, is even more outlandish than Darwin's difficult theory of random mutation and natural selection. Just simply because it's not only random mutation and natural selection, it's random mutation and natural selection on steroids trying to get there. So it's important to address these things. Those theories are out there, especially online. So I think we can pretty safely conclude that the best explanation for how we got here is not now, nor is it ever going to be deposited by extraterrestrial means. I think we can probably wipe that one off the map. We can debate the question of naturalism versus creationism or intelligent design, whatever you want to call it. But I think most everybody should draw the line before we get to the idea of extraterrestrial intervention on this one. So anyway, wanted to put that out there this week. This is going to be a relatively short episode to make up for the long one that we had last week. We're going to continue to hit a couple of other items around this topic as we go forward. Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked today's episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. You can reach out to us at proof2grace.com on our website or via email at proof2grace@yahoo.com. We've really enjoyed having you on these podcasts. I hope you're getting something good out of this. And I hope that maybe, just maybe, especially with Christmas on the horizon, that time when we all maybe think about something a little bit bigger than us, that maybe, just maybe, somewhere out on the horizon, that idea of a personal relationship with a creator is something that maybe is an idea you might be warming up to. And if it is, you certainly can look at last year's episodes around the holidays, this year's episodes with Christmas coming up. There'll be lots of good discussion about that. But I hope to see you next time, and I hope that you've begun a greater journey to find that creator who loved us so very much, gave everything for you. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.